We were decorating the Christmas tree when Alina suddenly froze. Right above the fireplace, a stocking was hanging, soft red velvet trimmed in white fur, beautiful, perfect, and absolutely impossible, because Alina hadn't put it there. Neither had her son, and the person who used to hang stockings in that house had been dead for 3 years. I'm attorney Claire Morgan, and what we found inside that stocking changed every truth this family lived with. I arrived at Alina Hart's cottage just after sunset, the kind of December evening when snow falls gently and everything feels safe until it isn't. Alina stood on her porch clutching her son, Brody, so tightly his small fingers were turning white. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Claire, someone was inside before we got home." She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't confused. She was terrified in a way only a mother can be when her instincts scream danger. Inside the house, nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place except that one stocking. It hung perfectly centered above the fireplace, like someone had taken their time, like they wanted it noticed. The velvet looked new, not a speck of dust, not a wrinkle. Brody wouldn't take his eyes off it. He kept whispering under his breath, "It's not his, it's not his," but he wouldn't tell us who his meant. I stepped closer and the air shifted. A coldness that didn't belong to winter settled in the room. The police unhooked the stocking with gloved hands. Everyone leaned in. Alina's breathing turned sharp, almost panicked. Inside was something small, heavy, and wrapped in brown paper. A single name was written on it in shaky handwriting. "For Brody, from Dad." Alina collapsed into a chair, because Brody's father had been dead for 3 years. And yet someone had walked into this house, hung a stocking, and left a gift only he used to leave. When I looked down, something else caught my eye, a faint, melting trail of wet boot prints leading away from the fireplace, straight toward Brody's bedroom. The moment we saw the wet boot prints leading toward Brody's bedroom, every officer in that house stiffened. Snow was melting into the hardwood floor, forming tiny puddles that reflected the yellow glow of the Christmas tree lights. Prints like these don't last long, which meant whoever had walked here had done so recently. Very recently. Alina rushed forward, but I gently held her arm. "Let us check first," I whispered. She nodded, her entire body trembling like someone fighting to stay upright in a storm. The officers moved down the hallway with slow, cautious steps, flashlights cutting through the dimness. The cottage was small, narrow hallway, wooden floor, old heating vents humming faintly. A place that should have felt warm, yet that night it felt like it was holding its breath. Brody walked beside his mother, clinging to her coat. He kept murmuring the same sentence over and over again, almost as if he was fighting with himself. "It can't be him, he wouldn't come back, he wouldn't." I crouched down. "Brody," I said softly, "who do you think put that stocking there?" He looked up at me, eyes wide, scared in a way a child should never be. "My dad used to leave stockings like that with my name inside every Christmas morning." His voice cracked. "But he's gone. Mom said he's gone forever." "Your mom is right," I whispered. "But someone wants you to think otherwise." Before he could answer, one of the officers called out quietly, "Claire, you need to see this." We followed the sound. Brody's bedroom door was slightly open, not much, just enough to show that a tiny draft of cold air was slipping through. The window inside the room rattled softly with the wind, even though the rest of the house was still. I stepped closer and my heart tightened. The boot prints didn't stop at the door. They went inside. When the officer pushed the door open completely, the cold hit us immediately. Not winter cold, not the kind that sneaks in through cracks. This was the kind of cold that feels intentional. Brody's toys were untouched. His comic books stacked neatly. His small bed sat against the wall. But what made Alina gasp, what made her grab onto the doorframe to keep from falling, was what sat on the pillow. A second package, wrapped in the same brown paper. Same shaky handwriting, same message. "For Brody, from Dad." Alina covered her mouth with both hands. Brody hid behind her, peeking out with one terrified eye. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The house felt suspended in silence, like even the walls were listening. One officer used gloves to lift the package. It was heavier than it looked. I looked around the room, scanning everything. And that's when I noticed something chilling, something that didn't belong. On the windowsill, lying in a thin layer of melted snow, was a single black button. Not the kind from a child's coat, not the kind from Alina's clothes. Not even modern, it was old, scratched, weathered, like it belonged to a jacket from another decade. Alina, I asked quietly, did your husband ever own something with buttons like this? Her face drained of color. He had a black wool coat he wore every winter the year before he died. Her voice cracked with fear, confusion, disbelief, a mix so strong it pulled her shoulders forward. But it was buried with him in his casket. I chose it myself. The room grew even colder. One of the officers whispered, "Ma'am, are you absolutely sure the coat was inside the coffin?" A question no grieving spouse should ever be forced to answer. Alina pressed her fingers to her forehead and sobbed. I saw them close the casket. I saw them lower it. Why would you ask me that? Why? I placed a hand on her back, grounding her. Alina, we're not saying what you fear. But someone wants you to believe your husband didn't die. Someone wants your son to believe it. And that someone has been inside this house twice. Brody finally stepped forward. His small voice broke the silence. Mom, if Dad is gone, then who knows how he signed the gifts? It was a question none of us wanted to answer. The officer handed me the second package. We should open them at the station, he said. Not here. Not with the child watching. But Brody shook his head. No, Dad always said Christmas gifts should be opened at home, together. There was heartbreak in that sentence, pure, innocent heartbreak. Alina wiped her tears and knelt beside him, holding his cheeks in her hands. Sweetheart, I promise you will open them, but not until we know they're safe. Just then, something happened that made every muscle in my body tense. The front door creaked, slowly, softly, like someone was pushing it from the outside. The officers rushed toward the sound. Alina grabbed Brody and pulled him close. I felt every instinct sharpen, that primal sense that danger wasn't just near, it was right outside. By the time we reached the living room, the wind was howling against the door. Snow swirled violently outside, but there were marks, fresh marks on the wooden step. Footprints, not walking away, approaching. Alina whispered, voice barely there. Claire, someone came back. And for the first time that night, I realized something deeply unsettling, something that made my pulse hammer in my throat. The footprints we saw earlier leading toward Brody's room were not the same as the ones forming now. Meaning there were two sets of prints, meaning two different entries, meaning whoever had left the stocking was not the same person now standing outside the door. The officers swept toward the door, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. Alina held Brody so tightly the boy's face was pressed into her coat, but he didn't struggle. He was too scared even to breathe. Snow swirled outside, the wind rattling the windows, but something about the moment felt wrong, a presence heavy enough to thicken the air. When the officers pulled the door open, the storm rushed in. But nobody stood on the porch. No shadow, no retreating figure, no car driving away. Just swirling white and an icy gust that cut straight through the house like a warning. But the prints were still there. A fresh trail sinking deep in the snow, leading up to the step and stopping. Stopping as if the person had simply vanished into the air. The nearest officer bent down, examining the shape. Not the same pattern as the ones inside, he muttered. These are heavier, larger, someone else was here. Alina's voice cracked. Why would two different people come to my home? Why tonight? Why Christmas? She wasn't just scared now, she was unraveling. There's a kind of fear that sits on the skin and another that sinks into the bone. Alina had both. I helped her sit while the officers secured the perimeter, sweeping flashlights across the yard and calling out instructions. The snow muffled everything, it felt like the whole world was listening, but no one was speaking. Brody tugged on my sleeve. Miss Claire, do stockings come on their own? His voice was so small, so painfully hopeful, it cracked something inside me. No, sweetheart, I whispered. Someone brought it here. He swallowed hard and looked at the door, then at the hallway toward his room. Then why are there two? He murmured. A thunderous silence fell over the room. I glanced toward the mantel. Two stockings, the red velvet one we found earlier and a second one, a plain, knitted stocking I didn't remember seeing before. When did that get there? One of the officers asked sharply. But Alina just stared at it like she was seeing a ghost wearing her husband's face. That one was his, she whispered. My husband's. I packed it away after he died. I haven't touched it in years. Brody stepped closer to it, eyes wide. That's Dad's stocking, he said slowly. Why is it up now? The knitted stocking was hanging too neatly, too deliberately. Someone had taken their time shaping it, smoothing it, aligning it with the other one. Whoever placed it there wanted us to see it. I scanned the room again, noticing something I missed earlier, the faintest sprinkle of melted snow not far from the fireplace. Not enough to mark footprints, but enough to hint movement. Someone had been in here more than once. The officers exchanged looks, their expressions hardening. No one wanted to say it aloud, so I did. "We are not dealing with one intruder," I said quietly. "We are dealing with two." Alina let out a broken sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. "Why? What do they want from us?" Before I could answer, the officer who had been examining the knitted stocking spoke up. "Claire, Alina, you need to see this." Inside the stocking was a folded slip of paper, old and yellowed around the edges like it had been kept somewhere damp. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but unmistakable. It was her husband's. Alina took a step back. "No, no, that's not possible." The officer read it aloud. "Check the attic." That was it. No greeting, no signature, just those 3 words. Alina shook her head violently. "My husband never went into the attic. He was terrified of it. He wouldn't write that." I looked at the officer. "Dust patterns," I instructed. "Check for movement." He nodded and rushed off with another officer, but something else bothered me. The knitted stocking was familiar, but the handwriting, the paper, the age stains, it looked older than 3 years, like it had been written long before he died. "Alina," I asked softly, "did your husband ever hide things from you? Anything unusual before he passed?" Her breath hitched. She hesitated, then she nodded slowly. "There was one thing, something I always wondered about." Just as she was about to explain, a heavy thud shook the ceiling above us directly from the attic. Brody screamed. Alina grabbed him. The officers drew their weapons and moved toward the attic ladder. The house, once warm with holiday lights and soft snow outside, now felt alive, like something was moving through the walls themselves. When the ladder was pulled down, a draft of freezing air spilled into the hallway. It was darker up there than it should have been, colder than any attic in winter should ever be. The officer climbed halfway before freezing in place. "Claire," he whispered hoarsely, "you need to come up here." My pulse hammered. I climbed the ladder, my fingers gripping the sides tightly. At the top, I saw what had made him stop. In the far corner of the attic, covered in dust, neatly arranged in a small, heartbreaking pile, were boxes of children's gifts. Wrapped in brown paper, every box labeled with the same handwriting. "For Brody," year after year. Starting from the year he was born, up until the year his father died, and then continuing after his death. Alina's husband hadn't left these. Someone else had been watching this family for 9 years. Someone who knew Brody. Someone who knew the house. Someone who wanted them to believe he was still alive. But why, and more importantly, where was this person now? Downstairs, another thud echoed, closer this time. Someone wasn't done with the house. Someone was still inside. The second thud shook the entire cottage, louder than before, closer than before. This one didn't come from the attic, it came from the hallway below us. The officers glanced at each other, weapons drawn, shoulders tense, breath controlled. I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked back at the pile of gifts in the attic, 9 years' worth of packages, lovingly wrapped despite the dust, the cold, the secrecy. It wasn't the work of a careless intruder or a thrill seeker. It felt ritualistic, intentional, almost protective. But protection doesn't break into homes. Protection doesn't leave messages. Protection doesn't lurk in attics while a child sleeps below. There was more to this story, layers hidden under layers. One officer whispered, "Claire, we need to move. Someone's downstairs." We climbed down the attic ladder slowly, carefully, like people descending into something alive and listening. Alina grabbed Brody as soon as she saw us, hugging him so tight he whimpered. But he didn't complain. That boy understood fear in a way he shouldn't have to. I crouched next to them. "Alina," I whispered, "before we go further, tell me what you were about to say. The thing your husband hid from you." Her eyes darted toward the dark hallway. She swallowed hard. "Before he died," she whispered, "he told me someone had been watching us." Her voice cracked. "He said it was a man from his past, someone who blamed him for a tragedy years ago. I didn't believe him then. I thought it was paranoia. But now," she shuddered, "I think he was telling the truth." Before I could ask more, one of the officers placed a hand on his earpiece. "There's movement in the kitchen," he whispered. "Stay behind us." Movement inside a locked house. While we were standing right there, the officers moved silently like shadows trained for danger. We followed slowly, my hand on Alina's elbow, Alina clutching her son like he was the last warm thing in the world. As we approached the kitchen, I could hear it, the faint scrape of something against the floor, slow, deliberate. A sound that didn't belong in a peaceful home. The officer stepped in first. Nothing. Just the old wooden cabinets, the pine-scented candle flickering on the counter, and the window covered in snow frost. Everything seemed normal, too normal, in fact. Then the scraping sound came again, but not from the floor. From the basement door, that door was old, paint-chipped, corners warped, and right now it was trembling, as if someone was pressing gently from the other side. Alina let out a small cry and clutched Brody tighter. "No," she whispered. "No, nobody ever goes down there. That door has been locked for years." The trembling stopped. Silence, then a single knock, soft, measured, intentional. The officers raised their weapons. Another knock. And this time a voice low, hoarse, impossibly calm. "Let me explain." Alina gasped. Brody buried his face in her neck. The officer shouted, "Identify yourself." The voice responded, slow and steady. "I'm here for the boy." Every hair on my arm stood upright. I stepped closer to the officers, my breath thin. "You're not getting anywhere near him," I said coldly. Silence again. Then the lock on the basement door, a lock untouched for years, clicked open from the inside. The officer shouted, "Stand back," and kicked the door wide. The basement stairs spiraled down into darkness, the kind that seems to swallow light whole. The air that rose from below was damp, cold, metallic, and the figure at the bottom of the stairs was a man, tall, wrapped in a heavy winter coat. Snowdrop crystals melting on his shoulders, his face hidden under the low brim of his hat. But his posture was strange, not aggressive, not violent. He stood still, hands at his sides as if surrendering. "I never meant to frighten the child," he said softly, "but it's time he knows the truth." Alina's knees buckled. Who are you?" He raised his face just enough for the dim kitchen light to catch his features. A scar on his cheek, sharp eyes, a face worn by years of weather and secrets. "I'm the reason your husband lived as long as he did," he said quietly, "and I'm the reason he died." The room erupted. The officers rushed forward, restraining him. Alina screamed. Brody began to sob. My own pulse thundered in my ears. But as they pinned the man to the floor, he didn't resist. He looked straight at me, eyes steady, voice unwavering. "You found the gifts," he said. "You saw the messages." I nodded slowly, breath trembling. "What do they mean?" I asked. He drew in one slow breath and said something that changed the entire direction of the case. "They're not from me." I froze. He continued, his voice steady and eerily certain. "And they're not from the boy's father either." A cold wave washed over me. Because if the messages weren't from him, and they weren't from the father, that meant someone else had been inside that house, someone who had not yet revealed themselves. The man looked at us all with an expression filled not with hatred but warning. "There's someone else who comes here," he whispered. "Someone more dangerous than me, and then he'll be back before midnight." For a long moment nobody spoke, not the officers, not Alina, not even the restrained man on the floor. His warning, "He'll be back before midnight," hung in the air like the cold breath of the storm outside. But his face, it wasn't the face of a man making threats. It was the face of someone who had accepted something inevitable, like he knew a truth none of us were ready to hear. One officer snapped, "Who's coming?" "Give us a name," but the man shook his head slowly. "You won't believe me until you see him." I stepped forward, crouching beside him. "Try us," I said firmly. "Tell us who's been stalking this family." He lifted his gaze, eyes sharp, almost haunted. "It's the man who raised me," he said quietly. "The same man who ruined your client's husband." Alina froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Ruined? My husband never told me." The man looked directly at her now. His eyes softened, the guilt pressing deep into his voice. "He tried to protect you," he whispered. "Both of you." He nodded toward Brody. "That boy, your son, he was never supposed to be found." A tremor passed through Alina so violently she nearly stumbled. "What do you mean found? Found by who?" He exhaled slowly. "My father." One of the officers muttered, "So your father is the real threat?" But the man shook his head again. "You're not listening." He spoke more urgently now. "My father isn't coming because he's already been here." A cold wind howled against the windows, almost on cue. I felt every instinct sharpen inside me. The man continued, "You think I left those stockings, those notes?" Those little gifts? He shook his head. No, that wasn't me. I only came tonight because I knew he would come too. Alina grabbed the edge of the table to keep from falling. Stop talking in circles. Who is this man? What does he want with my son? He hesitated, then spoke a name that meant nothing to me, yet somehow chilled the room. Samuel Crichton. The officers exchanged glances, confusion on their faces. One muttered, "Never heard of him," but Alina stepped back as though slapped. "Crichton," she whispered. "My husband mentioned that name the night before he died." The man nodded. "He should have told you everything." "Everything what?" Alina demanded. The restrained man swallowed hard. "My father ran a private facility, a place where he kept children he considered special." His voice cracked slightly. "I was one of them. Your husband, he escaped with another child, a baby. He tried to save him?" Alina blinked, her face draining of color. "A baby?" The man nodded. "Yes, a newborn. Your husband took him away from my father, hid him, raised him as his own." Slowly, painfully slowly, Alina turned toward Brody. "Are you saying Brody, my son?" "Yes," the man said softly. "He is not your husband's biological child." Alina's hand flew to her mouth, her knees buckled. I caught her before she hit the floor. Brody clutched her coat tightly, confused, frightened. "My father experimented on children," the man whispered. "He believed some were gifted, marked, chosen. I don't know the details, he never let us see everything. But he believed Brody was the most important child he ever found." Alina sobbed, shaking violently. "My son is not an experiment." "No," the man agreed gently. "But my father believes he belongs to him." It felt like the ground shifted beneath us, like every truth we thought we understood had turned to smoke. I asked quietly, why the stockings, why the gifts? Why the handwriting made to look like the father's? The man looked up at me, regret burning in his eyes. "My father used them to see if Brody would respond, to see if he remembered anything from before the adoption. To lure him." His voice dropped to a whisper. "He believes that if Brody chooses to follow the clues, then he's ready to be taken back." A deep silence fell over the kitchen, thick, suffocating. Alina clutched Brody, sobbing into his hair. "No one is taking my son," she whispered fiercely. "No one." The man didn't argue. "He's not safe here," he said simply. "My father doesn't give second chances. If he came once tonight, he'll come again." An officer stepped forward. "Where is this father of yours now?" The man answered without hesitation. "In the woods behind the house." A hush fell. He continued. "He watched you all through the windows tonight. He watched me come in. He watched the gifts being found." Alina's breathing shattered. I steadied her shoulders. "How do you know he's still out there?" The man gave an answer that made my skin crawl, because I saw his tracks before I came down. "He circles the house in patterns, always clockwise, always slow." He inhaled sharply. "And when he makes a full circle, he enters." The officer looked at the clock on the wall. 11:23 p.m., 37 minutes until midnight. I whispered, "How long does one full circle take?" The man looked straight into my eyes. 38 minutes. The room turned to ice, because that meant he would reach the door in 1 minute, and then a soft creak echoed through the living room. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, approaching the front door. The man on the floor closed his eyes and whispered, "He's here." The footsteps outside were unmistakable, slow, heavy, crushing the snow with a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Each step landed with the weight of someone who was not afraid, someone who knew he was being listened to. The officers moved immediately, forming a protective line in front of the living room. Their radios crackled softly, but no one spoke. Words would only make the fear louder. Alina held Brody against the wall behind me, her breathing shallow, uneven, her eyes darting between the front door and her son's face like she was deciding which one she needed to protect more. The restrained man on the floor didn't struggle, didn't move, didn't look away from the door. He simply murmured, almost like a prayer, "Don't let him inside, don't let him speak to the boy." Outside, the footsteps reached the porch, then stopped. A long stretch of silence followed, the kind that doesn't belong in a home, the kind that feels like time itself is holding its breath. One of the officers raised a finger to his lips, signaling absolute stillness. The wind howled fiercely against the windows, snowflakes smacking the glass like tiny, desperate knocks. But there was no knock on the door, not yet. Whoever stood out there was waiting, listening, measuring us. I whispered to the officer closest to me, "Is backup on the way?" "They're 12 minutes out." We didn't have 12 minutes, not with a man like this. The door handle twitched, once, soft, almost curious, then a voice, calm, measured. Smooth enough to sound educated, but so cold it leached the warmth from the room. "Brody," Alina gasped. I stepped in front of her and the boy immediately. The voice continued, almost gentle. "Come open the door, son. It's Christmas." The officers stiffened. The restrained man on the floor jerked against the cuffs, panic flooding his voice for the first time. "Don't answer him, don't say a word." But Brody lifted his head. His small body trembled, but his eyes were locked on the door. Not curious, not hopeful, just drawn, like something in that voice had hooked into him. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't move, sweetheart." But he whispered, "I know that voice, I think I heard it when I was little." Alina choked back a sob. "No, no, baby, you didn't, you were never." The man on the floor cut her off sharply. "He's trying to trigger a memory, don't let the boy listen." The officer nearest the door shouted, "Identify yourself or step away from the house." The voice ignored him completely. Instead, it said in a tone that sent a shiver crawling up my spine, "I've brought something for you, Brody. It's the last thing your father left behind." Alina cried out, "Stop lying, he's dead, my husband is dead." Silence. Then the voice changed, darker, heavier, dripping with a kind of malice only certain kinds of men possess. "Alina Hart, your husband didn't tell you what he stole from me." I felt Alina wobble. Her knees shook violently and she pressed her back against the wall. The man outside stepped closer, close enough that his shadow passed under the thin crack at the bottom of the door. He was right on the other side. I steadied my voice. "You're trespassing on private property, step away now." Nothing, no retreat, no hesitation. "Instead, Claire Morgan," he said. My blood turned cold, he knew my name. "I've heard of you," he continued, almost conversational. "The lawyer who thinks truth can be controlled. Tonight we'll correct that." The officer flanking the door quietly clicked off his safety. I held up a hand, signaling him to wait, because something felt wrong. Something felt staged. The voice outside softened again, returning to that unsettling calm. "Emotions are high, perhaps this is not the moment for confrontation." A pause. "I'll give you all a few minutes to breathe." Then his footsteps began again. Slow, steady. Moving away, but not leaving. No, he circled the house, deliberate, heavy, clockwise. The same exact pattern the restrained man described. We could hear it clearly, step by step, rounding the walls, dragging the cold with him. Alina was trembling uncontrollably now. "Why is he doing that? Why is he circling?" The restrained man spoke in a strained whisper. "It's psychological, he likes the fear to build. He wants Brody to follow him. To feel drawn out of the house." I shook my head. "Not happening." But Brody was still watching the door, tears dripping silently down his cheeks. "He sounds familiar," he whispered. "I don't know why." I leaned closer, holding his hands. "Because someone used that voice when you were too young to understand. But you are not going anywhere, you're safe here." Another round of footsteps outside, slow, rhythmic, calculated. Then they paused beneath Brody's bedroom window. A knock echoed against the glass, soft but purposeful. Brody jumped. Alina screamed. And the restrained man finally said what none of us wanted to hear. "This is how he tests the walls. The child's fear, the mother's desperation, your reactions." I whispered, "What does he do next?" The man's answer sent a chill through every soul in that room. "When he finishes the third circle, he tries a door. When he finishes the fourth, he tries a window. When he finishes the fifth," he swallowed hard, "he stops hiding." I checked the clock. 11:36 p.m. He had already completed his second circle, which meant 3 more before he came inside. The house creaked again as he moved beneath the roof. Alina looked at me with eyes filled with pure, breaking terror. "Claire, how do we survive until midnight?" The clock on the wall felt louder now, each tick echoing through the cottage like a countdown to something we weren't prepared to face. 11:36 p.m. 24 minutes until midnight, and 3 more circles left before that man, that thing, outside would try to come in. The restrained man on the floor had stopped struggling. He lay still, shoulders rising and falling with uneasy breaths, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if calculating something, distance, timing, patterns, things only someone raised in fear could instinctively measure. The officers took positions at every entry point. Guns drawn, jawlines tight, hands steady, but their eyes betrayed them. They had handled break-ins, domestic disputes, even armed suspects, but this was different. This felt like they were preparing for a man who did not think like others. A man who did not fear consequences. A man who did not stop. The wind battered the cottage walls, mixing with the slow crunching of boots in snow as the intruder continued his deliberate ritual. Every few seconds the house would give a soft moan, pine beams flexing from cold, but tonight it sounded almost like the home itself was afraid. Elena held Brody in her lap on the sofa, rocking him gently. The boy clung to her like a lifeline. His face was buried in her chest, his small fingers twisted tightly in her sweater. I kneeled in front of them. "Elena," I whispered, "listen to me carefully. We will not let anything happen to your son. You're safe." She shook her head violently. "How can we be safe, Claire? He knows our names, he knows our house, he knows my husband, he knows my son." Her voice broke. "He's been here for years, leaving things, watching us. How do you fight someone who's been inside your walls before you even knew his name?" I took her trembling hands. "You fight him by not letting fear think for you," I said quietly. "You fight him by staying exactly where you are, with your son in your arms, surrounded by people who will not let him take a single step through that door." Her shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in the heavy surrender of a mother who has carried too much alone for too long. Another crunch of snow echoed, another circle, another step closer. 11:40 p.m., one of the officers spoke into his radio. "ETA of backup?" A static-filled voice answered. 8 minutes. Not fast enough. The restrained man's voice broke through the tension, low and steady. "You need to barricade the kitchen door. He favors that entrance when he moves to the fourth circle." "Why?" I asked. He looked at me, expression haunted. "Because that's where he took the children before. The kitchen door is closest to the woods. He likes the dark cover." Elena sobbed harder, covering Brody's ears even though he had already heard too much. The officers didn't argue, they moved fast, dragging the heavy oak table across the floor, bracing it against the kitchen doorframe. The scraping wood echoed like thunder in the small house. Once the door was blocked, a deep quiet fell. Then tap, 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 soft knuckles on glass, every head snapped toward the sound. The tapping came from Brody's bedroom window. The boy whimpered instantly, instinctively burying deeper into Elena's arms. Elena clutched him so hard he let out a sharp cry, but she couldn't loosen her grip, not now. The tapping continued. Slow, measured, like teasing, the officer moved toward the hallway. I followed, placing a finger to my lips, signaling him to approach silently. The air in the hallway felt colder, heavier, thicker, like fear had physical weight. We reached the bedroom doorway. The tapping stopped. The officer raised his flashlight and aimed it at the frost-covered window. And for one horrifying second, there was a face pressed against the glass. A man's face, pale, expressionless, watching. He didn't blink, he didn't smile, he just stared. The flashlight beam hit his eyes and they reflected back silver, not like a human eye, like an animal caught in headlights. The officer cursed and jumped back. The face vanished instantly, swallowed by darkness. Not ran, not stepped away. Just vanished. Elena cried out from the living room. "What happened?" I took a deep breath, forcing my heartbeat to settle. "He knows we're watching," I whispered. "He's testing the windows now." The restrained man shifted on the floor, wincing from the cuffs. "That was the third circle," he murmured. "He'll try the doors next." "Which door?" an officer asked. "All of them." A faint crash sounded outside, something metal falling over in the snow. 11:44 p.m. The man was moving faster now, his patience thinning, his ritual escalating. The officer at the front door yelled, "He's approaching the porch again." We all braced ourselves. Boots hit the wooden step. 1 step, 2 steps. Then he tried the handle. The knob twisted sharply, rattling violently. Elena screamed, covering Brody's head. "Police, step back or we will fire," an officer warned. But the man outside didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't shout. He just kept turning the handle, over and over, slow, relentless, methodical. I stepped beside the officer and projected my voice. "You are surrounded. Backup is minutes away. Leave now." The turning stopped. Silence. Then the voice returned, the same voice that had whispered to the boy before, but this time it was colder, more amused. "You don't understand," he said. "You can't stop me, not tonight." A chill crawled up my spine. One of the officers whispered, "Claire, he's enjoying this." The man on the floor whispered something too, something that made my blood run cold. He always enjoys it before he takes a child. I turned sharply. Why tonight? Why Christmas? Why now? The restrained man's eyes filled with something terrifying, awareness. He finishes what he starts on Christmas Eve, and your client's husband died on Christmas Eve. This is the anniversary. My lungs froze. Elena let out a guttural, broken sound. He killed my husband? The man nodded slowly. And he came back for what your husband took. A final crunch of snow outside, footsteps approaching for the fourth circle. And then the lights in the house flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely. The entire home fell into total darkness. Someone outside exhaled a low, satisfied breath. A silhouette moved past the window, and the restrained man whispered, "He's made the last turn. The fifth circle begins now." The house went black, not dim, not flickering, completely swallowed by darkness. The kind of darkness that silences breath, that magnifies fear, that makes the walls feel too close. For a moment, no one spoke. The storm raged outside, but inside it was dead quiet, the crushing, suffocating quiet that comes right before a scream. Then a soft, satisfied exhale from outside the window. He knew the power was gone. He had planned for it. He wanted us blind. He wanted us scared. Brody whimpered in the dark and clung to Alina. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, I'm right here." But I wasn't convincing anyone, not even myself. The officers activated their flashlights. Thin beams cut through the darkness like trembling swords. The cottage looked smaller under that harsh light, more fragile, as if the shadows themselves were waiting. The restrained man's voice trembled for the first time. "He's starting the fifth circle. That's when he stops teasing. He's coming in." I whispered sharply, "How? The doors are locked. The kitchen is barricaded." "He doesn't need the kitchen," the man choked out. "He uses the attic." A cold wave crashed over me. "We just came from the attic," I hissed. "There was no one there." "He hides in the crawl space behind the beams," the restrained man gasped. "No one ever looks there. It's where he stayed when he took children before." The officers stiffened. One of them spoke into his radio, voice shaking. "Back up, we need ETA now." 2 minutes, the dispatcher responded. 2 minutes. But outside, the footsteps stopped. Dead still, like he was listening again, measuring the house, measuring us. Then creak, not from outside, from above. The attic. Elena's scream sliced through the dark, raw and helpless. "No, no, he's not taking my son, he's not." The officers rushed toward the hallway, weapons raised. I followed closely, my flashlight beam trembling despite my best effort to steady it. Another creak, another step from above, slow, heavy, intentional, like someone testing each beam before shifting their weight. The hallway ceiling shuddered. Dust rained down in a thin curtain. Brody whispered in the dark, "He's in my room." Elena sobbed, shaking uncontrollably. One officer climbed the attic ladder, his flashlight slicing upward into the black void. "Police, show yourself." Silence. Then a whisper floated down, not loud, not forceful, just close, too close. "Brody!" The officer scrambled up the last few rungs, shining the beam wildly into the attic darkness, but the voice kept moving, traveling through the beams like it had no source. "Come now, it's time," Brody cried out. "Make him stop." I rushed back to Alina and the boy, holding them both. "He can't get through us, I promise." The officer shouted from the attic, panic tightening his voice. "He's not up here. I can't see anything." But the restrained man, the only one who truly understood this predator, shook his head. "He's not in the open," he whispered. "He's above the beams. He's crawling." The ceiling above us groaned, long, slow, painful, like something long and heavy was dragging itself across wood. Elena covered Brody's ears, rocking him. "Make him stop," she sobbed. "Please, Claire, please." I steadied her face with both hands. "Elena, look at me. You are not losing your child tonight, not while I'm breathing, not while any of us are here." But even as I said it, the ceiling vibrated again. Then a hand punched through. Fingers, long, thin, white with cold, clawing down into the hallway like something reaching from the grave. Elena screamed. Brody shrieked. Officers fired upward, wood splintering in bursts. The hand jerked back into the darkness. The attic went silent. Too silent. The officer at the top of the ladder yelled, "He's moving fast," toward the back of the house. Another crash above. Another beam shuddering. He was circling inside now. Around us, hungry, determined. And then the house fell quiet again, not a creak, not a whisper, just nothing. The restrained man whispered, voice hollow. He's choosing his entry. I swallowed hard. Which one? He looked directly at me, fear carving lines across his face. The fireplace. The realization hit all of us at once. The stockings, the gifts, the messages, the ritual. The fireplace was his symbol, his path, his doorway. The living room erupted in chaos as we rushed back, flashlights shaking, hearts pounding. The fireplace embers glowed faintly, just enough to illuminate the mantel. And then a sound, soft, faint, ash shifting, something descending. Something sliding down the inner brick. Alina pulled Brody behind the sofa, covering him with her entire body. The bricks trembled, dust fell, soot fluttered like black snow, and then a boot appeared, heavy, black, old. Another boot followed. A leg, the hem of a coat. The man, Samuel Crichton, dropped silently from the fireplace, landing in a crouch, completely unharmed. His eyes lifted. Silver, reflective, wrong, he smiled. A slow, horrific curve of the lips that was devoid of warmth, humanity, or sanity. Good evening, he said softly. It's time. Every officer aimed their weapon. On the ground, one yelled, but Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them, his gaze locked on the child. Brody, he murmured, you've grown. Alina lunged, screaming, he's not yours. Samuel stepped forward. Everything you own, he said quietly, was borrowed. The boy returns now. He took another step. I stepped between him and the family. You're not touching him? He smiled again, a sick, fascinated smile. Claire Morgan, he whispered, step aside. I didn't move. Officers shouted warnings. Samuel didn't care. He lifted his hand, pale, skeletal, shaking with anticipation. And then a gunshot split the air. Samuel jerked backward. One officer held a smoking weapon, breath heaving, terror etched in his face. Samuel staggered, fell to his knees, eyes still locked on Brody, then collapsed forward onto the floor. Silence swallowed the room. The officers advanced cautiously, securing his body. No pulse, no breath, no movement. It was over. After 9 years of stalking, 9 years of watching, 9 years of leaving gifts, he was gone. Alina collapsed over her son, sobbing into his hair. I sank beside them, placing a hand on her trembling back. It's over, I whispered. You're safe. But even as I said it, something caught my eye. On the floor where Samuel fell, half buried in soot, was a final package. Small, brown paper, tied with a thin string. I picked it up slowly. It read, for Brody from Dad. I froze. Because the handwriting was not Samuel's, and not the father's either, which meant someone else had been in that house, someone Samuel feared, someone he warned us about, someone who had not yet revealed themselves. I looked at the walls, the windows, the darkened corners, and felt a truth settle over me like ice. This wasn't the end. Someone else was still out there, watching, waiting. The stockings were only the beginning.